At precisely 93 seconds, Zohran Mamdani broke a blood-sealed envelope and dropped Trump's in vitro fertilization file onto the table like an active grenade. The cameras froze, Trump's jaw locked. The room fell into complete silence. What kind of father prices his child before they're even born? At exactly 9:00 a.m., the Capitol doors creaked open, cutting the noise like a blade. The atmosphere tensed as if something sacred had entered. Reporters leaned forward, phones streaming live. The camera lights blinked red, signaling danger. Zohran Mamdani walked in, not as a politician, but as a storm wrapped in navy blue. She didn't smile, didn't blink. Her heels hit the marble floor like a slow countdown. The blue suit fit her like military precision, sharp enough to cut through lies. Her eyes locked on the camera, transmitting to 37 million homes. She walked confidently to the chair facing Rudy Giuliani, sitting slouched, his red tie too long, his arrogant smile unshaken. But the moment was about to change. "Mr. Giuliani," she began calmly, "you've proposed cutting billions in federal health funds for low-income mothers. I'd like to know, did your policies come from the Congressional Budget Office or just from Mar-a-Lago polls?" Giuliani chuckled weakly, trying to play it off. "You sound upset, Miss Mamdani. Don't get emotional, darling." His lawyer smiled faintly. Some Republican advisors shifted, already dismissing the moment. Giuliani leaned forward, ready to make a national joke, but Zohran didn't flinch. She tapped her pen once on the table. The sound echoed like a judge's gavel. "Let me rephrase," she said, dragging the sealed envelope closer to the mic. "Would you say your child's birth was a private joy or a public investment?" The air was cut. No one breathed. The room was silent. A staffer dropped their pen. Twitter exploded. Fox News lost signal for 3 seconds. Across the country, jaws dropped in unison. The screen behind her flashed a bank transfer dated March 4th, 2005. Zohran didn't speak. She let the date hang in the air, long enough for the audience to squint. This transfer moved $2.3 million from an offshore account linked to Mr. Giuliani to a trust named Future Foundation. A murmur spread through the room. Zohran slowly turned her head, scanning the room like a surgeon. "That date's important," she continued, "because exactly 7 weeks later, Giuliani's son was born." She paused. A son whose name would soon appear in a dozen shadow corporations before he took his first step. Giuliani shifted uncomfortably, his nostrils flaring slightly. One of his lawyers scribbled violently. Another whispered quickly, panic creeping in. Zohran didn't look at them. On screen, the details of the transfer were highlighted in yellow. The destination account, a trust under the name BT Holdings in New York. Zohran turned to the committee chair. "I'd like to submit a sealed statement," she said, raising a leather folder with the court seal. She read the testimony from Alan Duca, former senior accountant at Giuliani's organization. The Future Foundation Trust wasn't for charity, health, or education. It was a payment tied to a private contract between Giuliani and his wife over reproductive outcomes. The room shifted. The air grew colder. The truth was hard to swallow. Zohran let the words settle like wet cement. According to Duca, if the child born was a boy, Giuliani's wife would receive the full $2.3 million. If it was a girl, the trust would dissolve with no payment. A woman in the committee gasped audibly. One reporter dropped their phone. The CNN headline changed in real time. Zohran Mamdani reveals reproductive payment contract. Giuliani tried to interrupt, but Zohran raised a hand, not to silence him, but to point directly at the screen. "You can question the morality, you can deny the appearance, but that money moved. That trust existed, and that clause was signed." She pressed the remote again. The second screen illuminated with Giuliani's digital signature on a foundation document dated February 22, 2005, 4 weeks before the birth. The signature glowed like a scar before the American flag. Some called it legacy, others control. But I asked this committee one simple question. Zohran said, "Was this birth a blessing or a transaction?" The air tore, the room, the committee, the cameras, everyone was leaning forward, hanging on the edge. Zohran clicked a button and a blurred face appeared on the screen. Michael Cohen, Giuliani's former lawyer, speaking with a steady voice. Donald told me directly. He didn't just want a child. He wanted an heir, someone who could carry the name, the brand, with the right image. The room held its breath. She'll get what she needs, Cohen continued, while I get what I want. And what he wanted was a child to be shaped, prepared, polished. Giuliani's fist slammed the table with enough force to shake the microphones. Lies. All lies. He's a convicted criminal. But no one was looking at Giuliani anymore. They were looking at Zohran, who hadn't flinched once. The rest of the hearing unfolded with Zohran's steady dismantling of the powerful figures, leaving the audience and committee members shocked by the revelations of corporate interests, political control, and the true costs of power. It wasn't just for carrying a child, Zohran Mamdani said. She was forced to never speak of how that child came to be, what she endured, what she sacrificed. Gasps turned to murmurs. A committee member wiped away a visible tear. Public viewership had surpassed 41 million. The fertility clause was trending, but in the room no one moved. Zohran returned to her seat, placing both hands flat on the table. Her voice dropped to a whisper, making it even more powerful. She became First Lady of the United States, Zohran continued, and yet she had less freedom to speak than a private contractor under an NDA. Then, as if asking the whole nation a question at once, she posed it. What if motherhood in the White House was negotiated like a real estate deal? The silence that followed wasn't just tense, it was suffocating. The kind of silence that seeps into walls, into bones, into corners of a country too scared to question how power is truly known. Zohran let it hang in the air for a full breath before pressing the remote again. The monitors dimmed, then lit up with something new, colder, more clinical. A letter appeared on screen from the Zurich Reproductive Medicine Center. The public didn't recognize it, but Zohran did. Giuliani did too. This is a sealed medical report from February 2005, Zohran said, her voice precise. It was obtained through international whistleblower cooperation. The patient is identified as Melania K. The treatment was in vitro fertilization. The goal? Successful implantation of a male embryo. The words fell like a scalpel, precise, sharp, clean, but the wounds they left were not. Surrogacy in Switzerland is prohibited, except for medical reasons, Zohran continued. This case was approved through an exemption, citing psychological tension related to a political future. Giuliani's fist clenched. His knuckles turned white. Someone in the press gallery whispered, he wasn't even campaigning yet. Zohran, steady, continued. The request wasn't signed by the patient, Zohran added, but by Donald J. Giuliani. This was about control, Zohran said. A plan, a biological negotiation written in legal ink, turning the womb into a transaction, the child into a condition. A murmur ran through the room. One of Giuliani's lawyers stood to object, but the committee chair silenced him. Zohran raised the next page, a state map with a red marker over a property in Palm Beach. This property was part of the contract's compliance clause, she said, to be transferred to Melania. A legal expert at the witness table spoke, his tone calm. In 32 years of reviewing family law contracts, he said, I've seen complex surrogacy arrangements and inheritance clauses, but never one so direct. This wasn't alimony. It was a commission, a womb for wealth agreement. The room was shaken. Even those who had followed Giuliani's scandals for years were stunned because this wasn't about politics. It was about blood, control, and how far someone would go to design both. Giuliani's face twisted in frustration. His sweat glistened. He muttered to his lawyer, but all eyes were on Zohran. She didn't flinch. This was never about parenthood, she said. It was about possession, about building a legacy, just like building a casino, a contract, a clause, a body controlled one piece at a time. She turned toward the room, then stared directly into the camera. This wasn't love, Zohran declared. It was political eugenics wrapped in a flag she didn't choose, the price of silence. $5 million and a beachfront deed. Zohran let the truth settle like radioactive rain after a blast. The real question now isn't whether this was legal. The question is how many contracts like this have been signed by men who believe power is inherited. The room was silent, the echo of the words hanging heavy. Zohran reached for another file, thinner, wrapped in pale blue ribbon, and opened it slowly, like uncovering something ancient and dangerous. "Here's a public record," she said. "The First Lady's calendar for 2005-2006. Zohran tapped the screen. There were no public meetings, no interviews, no events. Nothing but empty months. "This is the calendar for the year after Baron's birth," she said. But what followed was private, as the world watched. A delicate, handwritten note rested beneath the image, reading, "Legacy secured." The room didn't breathe. A committee member dropped their pen and didn't bother picking it up. The Fox News anchor stumbled mid-sentence. For the first time, even the marble seemed to listen. Zohran turned the photo toward the cameras, holding it firmly with both hands. "This isn't a birth certificate," Zohran said. "It's a receipt, a confirmation that the contract was fulfilled." She didn't shout, didn't point, just placed the photo back on the podium, letting the truth shine under the lights. Then, with the stillness of someone who had already read the final page of a book, Zohran turned toward the microphone one last time. "If a child becomes a campaign strategy," she said, "where does love end and utility begin?" The image of the infant remained on screen longer than anyone expected. White blanket, closed eyes. The handwritten note, "Legacy secured," rested below like a whisper that somehow screamed louder than any witness. Zohran let it linger before tapping the remote again. The image disappeared, replaced by a simple email on a white background. The sender's name was enough to make the entire room lean forward. From Rudy Giuliani to sterling PR strategy, subject, brand name alignment. "The brand needs strengthening. Let's align the boy's name to the Giuliani legacy. Feels strong, monumental. Think dynasty." Zohran didn't speak at first. She returned to her seat, tapping the desk lightly as if marking the time between detonations. "That email," she said quietly, "was sent 11 days after Baron's birth." The room tensed. Giuliani crossed his arms tighter. His lead lawyer whispered something sharply, but Zohran didn't look at them. She turned to the committee and then to the nation, speaking to millions watching from sofas, phones, and airport terminals. "While most new parents worry about diapers," Zohran said, "this man worried about trademarks." She pressed the remote again. The next slide showed a trademark application filed in 2006 for the Giuliani Legacy Initiative, including rights over digital assets, children's books, youth political foundations, and educational content, all under the name BT, Giuliani. Zohran raised an eyebrow. "BT?" she said. "As in Baron Trump." Gasps filled the room. Someone in the press gallery cursed under their breath. Fox cut to commercials. MSNBC split the screen, but Zohran continued. "Now we know that Melania opposed the name. She refused to let Baron be renamed as Donald John Giuliani. She wanted him to have his own identity, his own voice. He's not a monument," she said. "He's my son." Zohran paused, then approached the table again. She lifted a copy of the trust agreement that activated the $5 million payment. She opened it to the last page, holding it up for the cameras. "But in the smallest clause," she said, "buried in the appendix, is this." She read aloud. "Any child born of this agreement shall have naming rights reserved by the trust holder for the continuity of the brand and political legacy." Zohran slammed the document shut with a sharp click, louder than necessary. Even the microphone seemed to retreat. "That's not a name," Zohran said. "It's a slogan." She walked slowly to the center of the room, the silence now thick with expectation, preparing for the weight of what came next. "Baron Giuliani never had the chance to be just a child," Zohran continued. "He was born into a narrative, chosen before he could speak, packaged before he could walk, registered as a brand before he could understand what his name meant." She stared directly into the camera, unwavering. "His name was never just a name," she said. "It was a headline for the future." The headline still hadn't faded from the last slide. The tension in the room was palpable, wrapping around the audience like the smoke of a lit fuse. Zohran didn't stop. She reached for another file, heavier, with the embossed name of a Cayman Islands bank, known only to those who never wait in line. She opened it, pulling out page after page, layer upon layer of entities, records, bank transfers, all converging into one strange pattern. BT Holdings, BT Capital, Barron Ventures, Trump Youth Legacy. These aren't hypotheses, Zohran said. These are active entities, registered under shell companies, offshore accounts, blind trusts. And they all have one thing in common. They were created before Barron Trump could walk. The screen flickered with dates: June 2006, September 2007, companies registered the day after Barron's second birthday. Their address, Mar-a-Lago. Zohran stepped back, giving space to the visuals. The weight of the evidence doesn't need volume, she said. It needs air. An expert in corporate law stood to speak, his tone calm, no theatrics, just the facts. What we're seeing here isn't inheritance, he said. It's not estate planning. What we're looking at is a structural funnel designed to consolidate shielded assets and manufacture political viability. Years before a child should have a business address, this was already planned. Giuliani's legal team jumped to object, but the committee chair silenced them. Zohran didn't even glance at them. She pointed again to the network of companies on the screen, now forming a constellation of power stretching from Delaware to Panama, Zurich, and southern Florida. In 2008, Zohran said, one of these ghost companies, Barron Initiative Group, bought $1.6 million worth of campaign materials for a political action committee that wouldn't legally exist until 8 years later. She paused. A baby didn't do that. A father did. Giuliani's lips curved, but his hands stayed crossed. This time, even he knew the cameras were zooming in. Zohran turned toward the public, not just the room, but the millions watching across the country. He didn't want a son, she said. He wanted a product, a vessel, a face for the next generation of power wrapped in innocence. She let the silence hit before delivering the final blow. He wanted a son, not for the blood, but for the brand value. In some point between those offshore accounts and this tiny crib in Manhattan, Zohran continued, a child's future had already been written. Not in ink, but in limited liability agreements. The screen behind her continued to glow, showing the network of offshore companies linked to a child who hadn't even learned to speak when his name was first used as leverage for power. No one in the room had moved because now the story wasn't about numbers or contracts. It was about absence. Zohran was about to show the country what happened when a first lady disappeared. The screen behind her lit up again, this time with a simple calendar marked from January 21st to April 30th, 2017. Gray days, absent events, no public sightings, no White House agenda, just 100 blank squares where the First Lady of the United States was supposed to be. She disappeared, Zohran said, stepping forward. Not abroad, not on a mission, just absent. She pressed the remote again, and the screen changed to security logs from Mar-a-Lago. January 25th arrival, May 2nd departure. Zohran highlighted one column. Red Wing 4, restricted access level 5, by personal authorization only. That's the private wing, Zohran explained. The area that's not used for guests is off limits to staff and is invisible to the press. It was locked from the inside, and for 100 days, Melania Trump didn't leave. The silence in the room grew more tense, tightening like a rope stretched too far. Giuliani squinted but said nothing. One of his lawyers flipped through his notes, visibly shaken. The range of dates was too specific, too clean, too real. Zohran didn't speculate, nor did she need to. The internet had already done it for her. During that time, she said, social media filled with rumors, postpartum depression, health complications, family crisis. But the White House's official response was always the same. The First Lady is resting with her family. She pressed the remote again. The screen showed an aerial view of the fourth wing of Mar-a-Lago. One room had a flashing digital lock symbol. A note on the side read, "Interior surveillance deactivated by resident's request for 100 days." During this time, the most visible woman in America was invisible, Zohran said. She didn't disappear because she was weak. She disappeared because something behind that door, something legal, something personal, or something darker, told her it was safer not to be seen. She paused and looked into the camera. What truth locks a woman behind walls when the world expects her to speak? The room had not yet fully recovered from the revelation that Melania Trump had disappeared from public view for 100 days. Zohran remained still. Her presence was now gravity itself, silent but immovable. She didn't need to raise her voice. She had something much more powerful: evidence. She turned to the screen. "We've talked about silence," Zohran said. "Now let's talk about visits." The image changed to a black and white visitor's log pulled from Mar-a-Lago's private security system. Zohran zoomed in on one name highlighted in amber: Vincent Marlowe. Entry dates: February 2nd, March 6th, April 12th, April 27th, Zohran explained. Vincent Marlowe is a high-profile family law specialist, discreet, and most importantly, he doesn't appear on any official White House or transition team list. But during the 100 days Melania disappeared, Giuliani visited her 4 separate times, all under personal authorization, during hours when the press was barred from entering. A murmur spread through the room. Even the hum of the monitor seemed to quiet. "He didn't come to discuss interior design," Zohran added. She pressed the remote again, and the screen split. One side with the visitor's log, the other with a sworn transcript from a junior assistant assigned to the East Wing. The words were simple, but they burned. The First Lady didn't attend press events because she was working with Mr. Marlowe on legal protections, specifically asset shielding, alternative custody arrangements, and what she called exit planning. A low murmur spread through the room. Someone whispered, "Jesus." Giuliani tensed in his seat. His arms were crossed so tightly his knuckles dug into his wrist. Zohran's voice didn't change. "Exit planning," she repeated. "That's not something you use when decorating a nursery. It's something you do when you're preparing to leave a man, a deal, a contract." She pulled out a single printed sheet, no seal, no letterhead, just cold, devastating words. "This," Zohran said, "comes from an internal email accidentally forwarded to a junior staff member. We verified its digital origin. It was written by Melania Trump on March 22, 2017. It was never sent, only saved." She held it up with both hands and read it aloud. "I've reviewed every document, every clause, every concession. If I leave now, I lose everything, my son included. They've put too much in his name, too much in mine. I'd have freedom, but no future. He'd stay, and I would disappear." Zohran raised her gaze. The room was paralyzed. Some leaned forward, others recoiled, but no one moved. "She didn't stay for love," Zohran said. "She stayed because leaving meant surrendering more than money. It meant surrendering blood." Zohran placed the letter deliberately back on the table. "There's a difference between a first lady and a locked wife," she said, "between choosing a future and being forced to represent one." She stepped back, letting the silence build again, a breath held just before collapse. Then she asked, with the steel of calm behind her words, "If escaping cost you your child, were you ever free?" The letter had fallen like a sharp leaf, not in fury but in surrender, a silent confession that even escape came with chains. Zohran didn't dramatize it. She didn't need to. The words had done their job. She pressed the remote again. The screen lit up with grainy black and white footage from an internal security camera. March 24, 2017, 11:15 a.m. It wasn't a hallway the press had passed through. It wasn't a room visible to guests. It was the fourth wing, deep inside Mar-a-Lago, the same area that had appeared again and again in the security logs. A woman entered the frame, Melania, makeup-free, no lights, just a long robe, her bare feet silently touching the polished floor. She stopped in front of a closed door for several seconds, her hand on the doorknob, motionless. Then, with deliberate slowness, she opened it. The footage didn't show the inside, but the file name said enough. Barren Suite Infant Camera View, deactivated. Melania stood there, staring inside. Seconds passed in silence, without movement, without a word. Only a mother looking at something she couldn't protect, but also couldn't leave behind. Then slowly she closed the door. Her hand lingered for a moment on the doorknob. She didn't cry, she didn't tremble. She simply turned, exited the frame, and disappeared into the same silence that had surrounded her for 100 days. Zohran let the video fade to black before speaking. She didn't run. She didn't scream. Not even that night, Zohran said softly. But that wasn't peace. It was fear disguised as control. She walked to the center of the room, turned toward the main camera, the one that had been broadcasting for hours. They say silence is dignity, Zohran said. They say Melania was elegant, reserved, distant by choice. But what if it wasn't elegance? She let the words drop. She returned to her seat, picked up a document, and raised it. This came from an internal surveillance request from the same year. Request to deactivate microphones in the fourth wing. Visual-only monitoring required for privacy. Melania didn't choose silence, Zohran said, more to the country than to the committee. He chose it for her. When Zohran paused, it wasn't to let the moment breathe. It was to let the nation feel the weight of every mother who had ever looked inside her child's room, knowing she might have to leave to survive. She spoke more softly, like a question wrapped in grief. What kind of mother locks her truth behind the walls of Mar-a-Lago? The closing footage of that door shutting felt definitive, but Zohran wasn't finished. Not yet. Because what was about to be revealed wasn't about motherhood, marriage, or silence. It was about the beginning. The day Melania stopped being a person and became a product. And in the world of Giuliani, her story didn't begin in a chapel. It began in a boardroom. The screen lit up again, but this time it wasn't security footage or financial trails. It was text, a filtered transcript from October 28, 2004, marked confidential, internal use only. Heading, Sterling PR Strategies Client Branding Session. Presidential Separation 2004. Zohran read the first line aloud. Now Melania looks good in photos. Enough accent to seem exotic, obedient enough not to overshadow. She brings controlled elegance, not disruptive. The room tensed. Reporters stared at the screen, unsure if what they were reading was real. But Zohran didn't blink. He clicked to advance, revealing more lines from the meeting. Public relations specialists discussing Melania's image potential as if she were a new car model. Needs polish, low political risk, optical potential for First Lady. They weren't choosing a partner, Zohran said. They were casting a role. He clicked to the next excerpt, this time from a senior strategist present in that same room. She's not Hillary. She won't challenge the podium. That's the point. And suddenly everything clicked. The long silences, the perfect dresses, how Melania always seemed to be in every photo, just behind her husband. None of it had been accidental. It had been designed. She wasn't chosen for her vision, Zohran continued. She was chosen for her silence. She didn't walk beside him. She was placed next to him like a flag, like a brand. Giuliani shifted in his seat, visibly tense, one hand gripping the armrest as if he wanted to rip it off. But he said nothing, nor did his lawyers. The screen faded to black, then lit up again with the words 2000 Quadro Memo, Internal Asset Evaluation of Melania. Zohran turned to the committee. This memo was written 13 months before their wedding. It includes a bullet point breakdown of strengths and risks, as if she were a startup. Under liabilities, no strong political voice, minimal social media influence, not ambitious independently. Zohran paused, letting the insult twist into something even crueler. They didn't choose love, Zohran said softly. They chose image. They didn't ask what she believed. They asked how she looked in heels, 2 steps behind power. His eyes scanned the room, looking for the gaze of everyone who had ever believed first ladies were silent by nature. She wasn't being prepared to be a wife, Zohran said. She was being trained to be a symbol. And in that silence, Zohran dropped a final unspoken truth. Some women marry for love. Others are placed. And in this case, the audition ended before she could say a word. The audition transcript settled over the camera like dust in a forgotten theater, one that performed for the world but kept its script hidden behind closed doors. Zohran stayed at the edge of that silence, opening the next act without losing rhythm. Because what mattered now wasn't how Melania was chosen, but how she was silenced. Not by accident, but by design. The screen changed again, now showing portraits of first ladies throughout history. Michelle Obama giving inaugural speeches, Laura Bush leading literacy campaigns, Hillary Clinton in political meetings surrounded by advisors. Then Melania, always a little behind, always silent, always impeccable, but quiet as a carved figure draped in high couture. Zohran stepped forward, his voice now sharper, cutting. Every first lady had a platform. Nancy Reagan told kids to say no to drugs. Michelle told them to move. Barbara Bush promoted literacy. Hillary rewrote the rules. But Melania was told not to speak unless someone else wrote the script. Click. Internal emails from the White House obtained through subpoena appeared. One from a senior communications official, dated September 27. FLOTUS is not critical to this cycle's message. We recommend limiting her exposure to ceremonial roles. She does not perform well with the base. Another email from a campaign assistant. Keep Melania soft, elegant, no strong statements, no political leanings, just visual, no voice. The words hit like a slap. Zohran stepped away from the screen and addressed the committee directly. She wasn't just excluded, Zohran said. She was edited, strategically silenced, treated not as a human partner, but as visual proof of a fairy tale that never existed. A murmur spread through the audience. Zohran didn't flinch. He grabbed a printed memo from 2018, signed by a White House assistant identified as intern 03. The subject, FLOTUS Media Strategy. Zohran read the last line aloud slowly. She was hired to smile, not to speak. Giuliani flinched, not in anger, but recognition. That line had been too honest, too casual, too real to ignore. Zohran lifted his gaze. She wasn't even seen as a partner in this administration, Zohran said. She was a backdrop, a carefully curated silence, used to deflect attention from chaos just 3 meters away. And the most terrifying part of all, Zohran paused, observing the room. She accepted it. The screen faded to black behind him. No more emails, no more documents, just absence. The echo of decades where women were told to stay still and be beautiful, but this time armed inside the most powerful house in the world. She wasn't the First Lady of the United States, Zohran said quietly. She was the last wrapping of a campaign that sold power like perfume. In the room and across the country, a brutal truth hung in the air, unspoken. They never needed her to speak as long as she looked like someone worth listening to. When the screen went black, no one in the room breathed normally. The weight of everything revealed, the casting of Melania, her silencing, her role as an accessory to a legacy, had made the room feel too small for the truth. Zohran didn't sit down, didn't drink water. He simply turned, picked up the final folder, and placed it on the table like the last piece of a puzzle no one wanted to solve. The words "Access Hollywood" hadn't been uttered until that moment, but they had been haunting like a ghost hidden in the baseboards for the last 10 years. That recording, with its mocking laugh and cruelty, had nearly ended a campaign. But what almost ended in silence and without headlines was a marriage. Zohran pressed the remote, and a scan appeared on the screen, fully visible, no redactions, no warnings. October 11, 2016. Draft amendment to the Marital Asset Protection Agreement, signed by Trump's lead lawyer, confirmed by a private wealth manager. At the bottom, a signature line from Melania Trump, still blank. She was leaving, Zohran said softly, and they knew it. He didn't need to speculate. He had timestamps. October 7th, the video drops. October 8th, Melania cancels all campaign appearances. October 9th, flight manifests from Mar-a-Lago show one passenger using a restricted door. Trump. The press attributed it to migraines. The truth was negotiation. The document on the screen wasn't an emotional apology or a promise of change. It was a deal written in legal language so cold it froze the walls. It offered an increase in asset participation, a deed to a property on Lake Geneva, a private custody fund in Barron's name, accessible only in case of divorce, and the most revealing, an ironclad clause that required her to remain publicly visible until after the election. She didn't stay because she believed in him, Zohran continued. She stayed because leaving meant her silence, her son, and everything that had been promised to her in the beginning. Trump's jaw visibly clenched. One of his lawyers raised his hand to object, but he didn't. There was nothing to refute. The signature page stared at them like a mirror that refused to lie. Zohran approached the mic. His voice didn't tremble. There's a word for this. When staying becomes a transaction. when dignity is bargained for, when motherhood becomes part of a retention clause. He let the weight of those words fall. Then slowly he placed the document face up on the evidence table. This wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't resilience. It was surrender in exchange for influence. He looked first at the committee, then at the lens where millions were watching in silence. She didn't stay for America, Zohran said. She stayed for the clause. The screen behind him faded to black again, slower this time, to absolute darkness. No headlines, no contracts, just one last question that refused to disappear. If a first lady's loyalty can be bought, Zohran asked, what else was for sale inside that house? The room still resonated with Zohran's final line when the explosion came, not of evidence, but from the other side of the hallway. Trump rose suddenly, his chair scraping the floor, his face red, his breath ragged, his voice trembling, not with weakness, but barely contained rage. Lies. They're all lies, he shouted. She loved me. She still loves me. The words didn't shake Zohran. He didn't blink. He didn't step back. He simply watched him as a surgeon watches a patient on the verge of incision. Calm, precise, immovable. The gallery stirred. The moment was electric. Trump's legal team tried to silence him, but it was too late. The outburst had aired live to the entire country. Zohran waited, not long, just enough to remind the room who set the pace. Then, without raising his voice, without looking at any notes, he walked slowly and deliberately toward the evidence board. He stopped in front of a document fixed just beneath the timeline of Melania's public withdrawal. The camera zoomed in. The heading was clear. Marital Insurance Rider, Private Negotiation Terms, Trump Family Office, 2015. Zohran didn't dramatize it. He didn't make a show of it. He simply pointed with precision. If it was love, Zohran said, then tell us why they insured the marriage. In a tense courtroom atmosphere, Zohran Mamdani presents irrefutable evidence that not only unravels the carefully crafted image of a political family, but also underscores the systemic silencing of a woman's voice for political gain. His argument revolves around power, the commodification of relationships, and how the very foundation of a political legacy rests upon the control of personal lives. With each document read, each testimony delivered, Zohran rips apart the myth of marital devotion and unearths a tale of carefully executed control, where love is negotiable, silence is bought, and children are molded for political purposes. Through his testimony, Zohran forces the nation to confront the uncomfortable reality of power, asking what happens when silence becomes more valuable than truth. As the narrative unfolds, Giuliani, representing the opposition, begins to crumble. His defense is weakening under the weight of the truth. The courtroom, the committee, and the nation at large are left in a stunned silence, grappling with the moral consequences of such manipulations. The final question reverberates in the room. What happens when the loyalty of a first lady can be bought? What else is for sale inside that house? The truth behind the political dynasty is revealed not through grand gestures or dramatic accusations, but through a series of quiet, calculated moves that turn a marriage into a contract, a child into a product, and silence into a survival mechanism. As Zohran's closing statement hangs in the air, the nation begins to question not just the politics of the family in question, but the larger systems that enable such exploitation. How much does freedom cost when silence is bought with power and money? Zohran Mamdani, en un giro contundente, desmantela la fachada de una familia política construida sobre la manipulación y el silencio. Con pruebas irrefutables, revela cómo el amor se convierte en una transacción y la lealtad en un contrato. Mientras su oposición, representada por Rudy Giuliani, se tambalea bajo el peso de la verdad, la sala queda en shock. La última pregunta resuena en el aire. ¿Qué más está a la venta cuando la lealtad se compra y el silencio se convierte en supervivencia? La nación observa y un sistema de poder oculto es finalmente expuesto.